a forgotten passage beneath Windsor Castle, a velvet pouch untouched since the Queen's final days. When Princess Anne steps forward alone, holding a sealed dossier from Elizabeth herself, even the royal council goes breathless. What she carried wasn't just parchment, it was a sovereign weapon. And when she uttered Catherine's name, the monarchy's foundation shifted forever. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with a key that hadn't seen light in decades, an iron relic kept in a locked cabinet beneath the white drawing room. Anne, always disciplined and decisive, moved without ceremony, escorted by two archivists and the keeper of royal protocol. They descended into a corridor sealed since the Queen's final illness, bypassing the usual royal record rooms. Only Elizabeth and one other knew of its existence. When the chamber door groaned open, there was no treasure, no jewels, just a lone black box, dust-lined and bound by velvet, resting atop a stone pedestal. Anne took it in silence. Inside, the Queen's wax-sealed envelope, bearing a simple inscription, to be delivered in the event of fracture. The seal bore the insignia of Elizabeth II's private crest, an emblem thought to have been retired. But this wasn't some ceremonial keepsake or forgotten farewell. It was a directive, and Anne already knew exactly where it needed to go. The moment Anne emerged from the lower vault, everything changed. She issued a rare internal alert code grey. No explanation, no allowance for protocol breakdowns. All palace aides and security details involved were placed under immediate blackout. Mobile access was revoked in their vicinity, and any discussion of Anne's movements was forbidden. The senior-most guards noted the way she held the document, not clutched in haste, nor paraded in triumph, but as if it were a burden. Resolute yet burdened, those were the whispered words passed between corridor staffers who witnessed her climb the eastern stairwell with trembling lips but unwavering steps. Within the hour, the royal council was summoned not for ceremonial gathering, but under emergency protocol. The order was signed by Princess Anne under her alternate constitutional designation as Royal Custodian Emerita. No reason was given, no agenda shared. Not even the Queen Consort was informed. Camilla, reportedly preparing for a scheduled diplomatic audience, was left waiting in a gilded chamber with no call to attend. That silence, more than anything, signaled the storm already rumbling beneath the surface. By the time the royal council gathered inside the Queen's gallery, a sense of electric dread filled the air. No media, no formal attire, just the closest witnesses to Britain's deepest inner monarchy. When Anne stepped in, her voice was even, her eyes steeled. Without flourish or delay, she held up the sealed envelope for all to see, announcing, "This document is not a relic, it is a royal instrument, drafted and sealed by Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, and it concerns the future authority of the Crown, as entrusted to the Duchess of Cambridge, Catherine." What followed was silence, long, weighty, and unforgiving. The document hadn't even been opened yet, but its mere presence shattered the illusion of calm that had cloaked the monarchy for months. From that moment on, nothing could be undone. Not the secrecy, not the weight of Elizabeth's intent, and certainly not the choice of Catherine's name on her final directive. For Anne, it was duty fulfilled. For the Crown, it was the slow unravelling of centuries of silent succession. For Catherine, whose name echoed through the chamber like a quiet bell, tolling a destiny she had never asked for, it marked the beginning of a storm she could no longer evade. That the words inside that velvet pouch would do more than honour Catherine, they would dismantle centuries of silent hierarchy. And no one saw it coming, written in Elizabeth's own hand, bearing the phrase, "to be opened in the event of national moral fracture." The sealed proclamation wasn't a will, it was a command. And in her fading days, the Queen had scripted a power transfer not to Charles nor William, but directly to Catherine. Why? The answer didn't come from speculation, it came from validation. As soon as the seal was broken, the Royal Cipher Office was summoned to verify the document's origin. Not one, but 3 separate confirmations were issued, including from the Keeper of Seals himself, who, in a rare moment of visible emotion, reportedly uttered, "She wrote this with the weight of 1,000 years." The handwriting was unmistakable, the tone stern, almost mournful, was consistent with Elizabeth's final months, but it was the content that shattered expectations. This wasn't a ceremonial note or a sentimental reflection. It was a direct constitutional shift, carefully crafted to be activated only when the Queen believed the crown itself was at risk, not from enemies abroad, but from corrosion within. Elizabeth Sykes' words were razor-sharp, deliberate, and haunting. She spoke not of loyalty or love, but of erosion. "There is a moral decay rising through the roots of our house," she wrote. "And though the face of monarchy smiles, its conscience is slipping." The statement was damning in implication. She feared the institution she had led for over 7 decades was crumbling, not because of the world around it, but because of those within it. And in the same breath, she made her choice known. She did not name Charles. She did not mention William. She named Catherine, by title, by virtue, by trust. "The Duchess of Cambridge shall carry my legacy, not as queen in waiting, but as the sovereign conscience of the crown. Her hand shall not wield the sceptre, but shall steady the realm when others waver." The phrasing wasn't symbolic. It was authoritative. This was Elizabeth, unfiltered, unapologetic, and utterly focused. And then came the second shock. The Queen referenced a document that had long been rumoured, but never confirmed, Appendix Windsor 4. With it, she hinted at the existence of a royal contingency framework, so secretive, even Charles had never seen it. She spoke of safeguards, countermeasures, and the need for a chosen executor to act should tradition collide with deterioration. The implications were seismic. Elizabeth had built an entire contingency quietly, without fanfare, based not on bloodline, but on character. And then came her final directive to Anne. "You alone, my sister, have held steady in every storm. You are the last immovable pillar. Deliver this, guard her, and do not look back." That sentence alone reframed Anne's stoic demeanour, not as distance, but as destiny. The Queen hadn't just trusted her, she had counted on her. And now, with the document opened and verified, Anne's loyalty would be tested on an unimaginable scale. In the drawing rooms of Parliament, whispers turned into thunder, bypassing the monarch, undermining the line of succession. The accusations brewed quickly, but those who read Elizabeth's final words knew this wasn't ambition, it was alarm. And in naming Catherine, she had chosen moral clarity over traditional command. But what was Appendix Windsor 4? And why had it been hidden even from Charles? Buried beneath decades of ceremonial fluff lies a document so dangerous it was locked in a separate archive, never digitized. Appendix Windsor 4 wasn't folklore, it was real. And it contained protocols for bypassing both monarch and parliament in times of ethical decay. Who could wield such unchecked authority? Elizabeth had one name in mind. For years, the very idea of Appendix Windsor IV was dismissed as palace gossip, whispered only in the corners of private libraries and high-level clerical offices. But it was no myth. It was a wartime construct conceived during the Cold War, when global instability forced monarchs and ministers alike to consider unthinkable scenarios. Elizabeth, barely into her second decade as queen, secretly commissioned a private council to draft an emergency plan, one that would ensure the preservation of moral authority should the crown ever face internal collapse. The document was never recorded in public archives. No copies were permitted, and it was signed only once in her lifetime, 6 months before her death. Its contents were staggering. The appendix outlined a sovereign framework, allowing for the creation of a royal protector, a singular figure granted override capacity in moments of constitutional paralysis and moral erosion. This individual could override both monarch and parliament under preset triggers, all of which were defined under phrases like breach of duty, ethical dereliction, and civic loss of faith. It was radical, it was surgical, it was terrifying, and it had only one failsafe. It required 2 signatures to activate, the reigning sovereign's and that of a second, blood-bound guardian. That second signature belonged to Princess Anne. In a date circled in quiet ink, March 2nd, just 6 months before Elizabeth's passing, Anne placed her name below her sister's. She had known. She had carried this burden in silence, shouldering the knowledge that the crown might one day need rescuing, not from enemies abroad, but from weaknesses within. She never revealed it, not to Charles, not even to the Privy Council. Her silence was not betrayal. It was obedience, to Elizabeth, to history, The appendix also created a role never before seen in the structure of monarchy as sovereign executor, neither monarch nor consort, not regent, not heir, an autonomous constitutional figure with the power to stabilize the realm in crisis. In every line of the appendix, this role is emphasized not as an extension of the crown, but as its anchor, and there, in firm, deliberate script, Catherine's name appears beside the title Protector Primus, not consort, not queen-in-waiting, protector. Elizabeth had reimagined the monarchy from within, bypassing tradition in favor of resilience. In a silent act of prophetic defiance, she had rewritten the structure of power, placing in Catherine not just trust, but unprecedented authority. And in doing so, she placed her legacy not in bloodlines, but in conscience. Catherine, through this document, now stood outside the hierarchy, above it, beyond it, and for those still clinging to the ladder of tradition, her new position was both blasphemy and inevitability. With the framework now exposed, the next step would ignite fury in Buckingham's highest chambers. When a black car pulled into the palace courtyard, past midnight, the cameras were shut off. Only 3 people entered the East Wing chamber: Princess Anne, Catherine, and the Keeper of Protocol. What unfolded over the next 3 hours would reshape the monarchy's chain of command and break one woman's heart. The silence inside the chamber was heavy, brittle, almost unbearable. Catherine, summoned without William, without Charles, walked through the corridors as if sensing the walls themselves were holding secrets. She had not been told why, only that it was urgent, only that Anne would be waiting. When she arrived, Anne did not embrace her. There was no welcome, no ceremony, just an envelope, worn with time and royal wax already opened. Anne's hands were steady, but her voice was taut with restrained emotion as she began to read aloud. The words were Elizabeth's. "She is the conscience I could not teach, because she already lived it. If the crown must endure, it must pass through her hands not to rule, but to cleanse." Catherine listened, at first frozen, then visibly shaken. By the 3rd paragraph, she broke down. No one moved, no one reached out. This was not a moment for comfort. This was a reckoning. Elizabeth had not intended for the world to witness this act of transfer. She had left no public roadmap, no performance. What she left was a responsibility, a burden disguised as honor. The Keeper of Protocol stepped forward next, holding the royal transition scroll. The scroll was blank, save for the royal heading and a solemn inscription at the bottom. "If you sign, you accept not power, but consequence." Alongside it lay the ceremonial ink, blacker than night, poured in a silver well reserved for only one other moment in living memory, the Queen's own coronation oath. But this was no coronation. There would be no crown, no trumpet, no throne. This was legacy in its rawest, most terrifying form. Anne then asked her the question, quiet, but irreversible. "Will you accept the burden and protect what remains?" There was no need to accept what would follow if she declined. The appendix would be buried once more. Elizabeth's final safeguard would remain a secret. The monarchy would stumble forward, exposed to the very decay Elizabeth feared. Catherine looked at the scroll, then at Anne, and finally at the ink. Her hand trembled, her breath caught, but she stepped forward, and she signed. Her name joined Anne's and Elizabeth's. The chamber held its breath, as if time itself paused. The keeper bowed. Anne whispered, "It is done." And in that moment, the Duchess of Cambridge ceased to be merely a figure in waiting. She had crossed into a realm even the crown dared not speak of publicly. She had become the sovereign executor, the invisible force beneath the visible throne. It wasn't the kind of power one flaunts. It was the kind that haunts, but not everyone remained unaware Camilla had already sensed a shift in the shadows. It was never meant to be public, but the confrontation was overheard, leaked, and impossible to contain. When Camilla stormed into Anne's private chamber demanding answers, the exchange turned royal tradition into royal warfare, and the Queen Consort's words, "You have played me like a pawn," would echo across headlines worldwide. Clarence's house had witnessed disagreements before, but nothing like this. The Queen Consort, already unsettled by days of unexplained absences and sudden council summons, arrived unannounced and uninvited. She had waited long enough. The whispers, the shifting loyalties, the silence from Anne, it had all become too much. What began as a private query turned quickly into a reckoning. Why am I being excluded from briefings? Why wasn't I informed of the East Wing session? Camilla's voice, typically measured in public, was now laced with fury, but Anne, ever composed, offered only one line in response: cold, unwavering, absolute. The Queen made her choice. That sentence detonated whatever restraint remained. Camilla accused Anne of deliberate sabotage, of hiding behind tradition, while executing a coup of silence. She called the Midnight Scroll ceremony a betrayal not just to her position, but to the entire idea of monarchical hierarchy. She hurled accusations of manipulation, accusing Anne of feeding her ceremonial duties, just to keep her distracted while real power was rerouted. Anne didn't flinch. She didn't explain. She simply stood her ground and made it clear Camilla had never been part of Elizabeth's final equation, and no amount of outrage could rewrite that truth. But Camilla wasn't going to retreat quietly. In the hours that followed, subtle leaks began to surface, selective lines from the Appendix Windsor Forth, words taken out of context but timed to stoke doubt. Allies within the court, those who had long depended on Camilla's patronage and protection, began circulating talking points to trusted media contacts. Suddenly, the public was whispering about a secret power transfer, a royal backdoor, a constitutional maneuver that bypassed both king and parliament. Camilla's message was clear. If she couldn't stop it in private, she would expose it in public. Anne, faced with the beginnings of a manufactured narrative war, responded not with rebuttals, but action. With authority granted through her custodial title and internal clearance from the Keeper of Protocol, she ordered Camilla's removal from all ceremonial briefings, pending clarity and internal cohesion. It was a calculated strike, public enough to be noticed, private enough to avoid full-blown scandal. And yet, within hours, the move was headline fodder. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, the monarchy felt like a house divided, and not just behind closed doors. But even as this clash between Anne and Camilla spiraled into a wisp, a war inside the palace and a frenzy outside it, something else was quietly unfolding. While the Queen Consort fought to reclaim a place she believed was hers by right, Catherine, now marked by ink, legacy, and decree, was already being prepared for her first test of power. With pen in hand and the ink still drying on her secret commission, Catherine issued her first constitutional reversal, reallocating over a dozen royal patronages from Camilla to herself and Lady Louise. It wasn't personal, it was strategic. But for the palace, it was the first unmistakable blow. The decision came not with a grand announcement, but with a formal directive quietly circulated among the Royal Charities Council and approved by the Keeper of Protocol. 12 patronages, many of which had recently been shifted to Camilla following Elizabeth's passing, were now reassigned. Each title carried weight, historical significance, international reach, and symbolic legacy, but Catherine wasn't aiming for symbolism. She was establishing structure. The list of newly reassigned roles reflected a deliberate reshaping of the monarchy's public face: children's welfare, early childhood education, maternal mental health, sustainable housing, youth development. These were not random choices. These were Catherine's long-standing areas of quiet work, now amplified through the power entrusted to her by Elizabeth's hidden decree. Perhaps most stunning was the inclusion of Lady Louise. With a single line in the document, Catherine named her adjunct royal patron, a position not seen since the Edwardian period and one that placed Louise directly under her oversight in all future charitable functions. For a royal previously kept out of the central spotlight, it was a dramatic elevation and a clear message. Catherine wasn't just consolidating influence. She was building an inner circle, and she was starting young. Fallout inside the palace was immediate. Camilla's inner circle, already rattled by her sudden exclusion from ceremonial briefings, saw this as nothing short of a power grab. A fury of leaks followed. Anonymous sources painted the move as cold, unprecedented, disrespectful to the Queen Consort. Private communications between aides were selectively fed to journalists, hinting at factionalism and covert maneuvering behind the scenes. Yet Catherine remained silent, not a word to the press. No public address, no televised explanation. She understood that power did not require justification. Anne, stepping forward in her role as the monarchy's last immovable pillar, issued a simple statement on Catherine's behalf. The Queen's directives remain in motion. All decisions fall within the scope of her final trust. It was calm, ruthless, final, and then came the public. If Camilla's camp expected sympathy, they miscalculated. Within 48 hours, national polls showed an unprecedented spike in support for Catherine. Headlines once steeped in suspicion began shifting tone. Editorials praised her decisiveness, calling her the people's guardian, the crown's quiet commander. Images of Lady Louise attending her first charity session under Catherine's banner began trending across platforms. For the first time since Elizabeth's passing, the public saw not a monarchy in mourning, but a monarchy restructured, revitalized, and resolute. Even as tabloids screamed chaos, even as rival factions murmured betrayal, the country took notice. This wasn't a consort waiting patiently in the wings. This was a woman chosen, commissioned, and unafraid to act. Catherine had signed a scroll in silence. Now, she was reshaping the crown in motion. Every move was legal, every shift was deliberate. And behind every quiet decision was the echo of Elizabeth's trust. And just as the nation began rallying around the Duchess-turned-decision-maker, Charles emerged shattered, conflicted, and unprepared for what Anne showed him next. He thought he was the heir, the torchbearer, but when Charles finally read his mother's handwritten addendum, "You were not to be burdened with this, Charles. The crown must pass through cleaner hands first." He reportedly fell silent for nearly an hour. The betrayal was not in the ink, it was in the absence of trust. The document had remained hidden from him longer than any other royal, even as whispers of transitions at Appendix Windsor 4 rippled through the corridors of Buckingham and Clarence House. Charles was deliberately kept uninformed, not out of cruelty but by design. It was Anne who made the decision to reveal it to him, and she did so not with glee or righteousness, but with a quiet sense of duty. She waited until the public furor surrounding Catherine's patronage order had begun to settle, until the machinery of protocol had adjusted itself to a new order. Only then did she present her brother with the full contents of the sealed appendix, Elizabeth's final structural safeguard, and the blunt truth behind why he had been left out. As Charles read line after line, the room seemed to fold in around him. Elizabeth's voice, preserved in her tight, unmistakable script, explained her decision in haunting clarity. "There is hesitation within you, my son. A caution that time no longer allows. The people do not doubt your love for duty, but they do doubt your strength in division." It was a mother's confession laced with sovereign logic. She wasn't punishing him. She was protecting the crown from what she believed he could not endure. For a man raised to wait a lifetime for power, it was a verdict more painful than abdication. The silence that followed was broken only by a whisper. Anne would later recall Charles turning toward her, tears visible, whispering almost to himself. "She didn't believe I could handle it. It wasn't anger. It wasn't resistance. It was heartbreak. Pure, unfiltered heartbreak." And yet, in that moment, Charles did not lash out. He did not call press briefings. He did not confront Catherine. Instead, he asked for a pen, and he signed the acknowledgement of the document's authenticity, a ceremonial but critical gesture of constitutional recognition. He agreed to uphold its terms. He agreed to remain silent. What he requested, however, was dignity. No leaks, no back-channel spins, no exploitation of his pain. He wanted the monarchy to move forward without his shame dragging it down. Later that evening, Catherine visited him. No aides were present. No one knows what was said. But when she emerged from the room, her eyes were swollen and her steps heavy. Whatever passed between them wasn't transactional. It was human, wounded, honest. A transfer of sorrow more than strategy. Charles had lost more than a role. He had lost the final strand of illusion that his mother had fully entrusted him with her legacy. And yet, in losing that illusion, he chose restraint over rage. Still king in title, but now acutely aware of where the true power had shifted. But while Charles wept quietly in private, one voice in Parliament had no such restraint. One leak, one paragraph. That's all it took to trigger an emergency session in the High Chamber. When news broke that Catherine now held constitutional override powers, the opposition erupted, accusing the crown of quiet coups and shadow queenship. But some MPs called it long overdue and dared the Prime Minister to challenge her. It began with a document never meant to leave royal hands. A single paragraph from Appendix Windsor IV, discreetly handed to a senior member of Parliament by an anonymous palace insider, found its way onto the encryptor. Group chat of a dozen MPs by morning. The line was clinical, almost sterile in tone. The sovereign executor shall possess advisory override authority during periods of internal compromise, vested through legacy appointment and verified custodial signatories. But its meaning hit like a thunderclap. Override authority, verified appointment, legacy signatories. It didn't matter how vague the language seemed. Everyone knew what it pointed to: Catherine, and within hours, the chamber was in chaos. By noon, the Speaker had been forced to authorise an emergency session joint participation from both the House of Commons and House of Lords. The mood was volatile. On one end, seasoned opposition MPs rose with fury, condemning the revelation as a threat to democratic sovereignty. They called it a betrayal of Parliament's supremacy, a return to monarchical absolutism, cloaked in protocol. If this stands, one MP barked, we are endorsing governance by inheritance and secret ink. Is that what this nation fought to evolve beyond? Cries of resign and unconstitutional erupted from the backbenches. And yet, on the other end of the chamber, a wave of resistance to the outrage began to grow. A younger generation of MPs, particularly those unaffiliated with the traditional royalist bloc, rose not to condemn but to clarify. One spoke passionately about Catherine's record, her consistency, her unblemished public standing, her role in stabilising institutions during moments of national grief. This is not about power grabs, she declared. This is about restoration. It's about legacy. It's about a queen who saw corruption coming and trusted someone who had already earned the people's trust. A ripple of quiet agreement followed. The Prime Minister, placed in an impossible position, offered little more than ambiguity. He refused to deny the appendix's authenticity. He declined to confirm Catherine's powers, but his most telling moment came in what he didn't say. When asked directly if the government viewed Catherine's new role as a breach of protocol, he replied only, "The monarchy and Parliament remain aligned in the pursuit of continuity." For some, it was cowardice. For others, it was strategy. But for all, it was confirmation that a silent constitutional evolution had already begun, and no one in Westminster was brave enough to challenge it head-on. Outside the chamber, public opinion remained divided. Traditionalists saw danger in Catherine's ascension, while the broader public, still energised by her recent patronage reforms, seemed largely supportive. Analysts debated the legal implications, scholars pored over historical precedent. But within the palace, there was no such luxury for delay. The next move had already been planned, but no legal debate could compare to what came next, a ceremonial appearance designed to silence all doubt or invite open war. They called it Clarion, a name not heard since Elizabeth's coronation rehearsals, as Catherine stood before the council holding the Queen's signet and the sovereign scroll. It wasn't coronation, it was confirmation. In the eyes of the ancient law, she now stood as executor primus, and the room knew. The monarchy had just crowned its future. The invitation was discreet, no trumpets, no parade, and yet its message shook the foundation of the monarchy. Clarion session, by order of the custodial signatories. A ceremonial summons unlike any other, only a few could trace its origins, rooted in Appendix Windsor IV, inspired by a rare pre-Victorian rite used to transfer sovereign stewardship in times of regency. And though this was not a coronation in name, every soul in the room understood its gravity. This was the moment the transition became visible, the moment quiet documents became public doctrine. Catherine walked into the council gallery, not as a duchess, not as a consort, but as a constitutional force. She wore no crown, yet around her shoulder hung Elizabeth's Order of the Garter sash, the same worn at state ceremonies for over half a century. In her hand, the sovereign scroll, sealed in silver and engraved with the signatures of Elizabeth, Anne, and now Catherine. This wasn't pageantry, this was prophecy fulfilled. At her right, Anne stood firm, unshaken, unmoved, the iron thread of legacy. And just behind them, seated in symbolic silence, Charles, no words, no protest, only presence. It was his way of acknowledging what had already been decided by someone greater than both of them. Camilla was notably absent. The official word was that she was unwell. But the omission was telling. She had been stripped from ceremony, omitted from briefings, and now erased from the optics of succession. There was no chair reserved for her, no whisper of her name. The final separation had been completed not by decree, but by disappearance. The broadcast, aired without fanfare yet watched by millions, captured the moment Catherine stepped forward to address the High Council. No speechwriters, no theatrics, just 12 words that would echo across the Commonwealth. For order, for memory, for the people. I accept this trust. With that, the scroll was sealed again, the session concluded. But the shift it represented irreversible. Behind the scenes, palace insiders began using a new term, the Catherine Regency, not yet official, not yet inscribed, but already felt. She was no longer a placeholder. She was the pivot, the figure through which the Queen's legacy and the nation's future now flowed. International headlines didn't mince words. Britain's hidden crown rises. Monarchy reforged in Catherine's image. Executor primus era begins. And within the walls of Windsor, where ancient oaths had been whispered for generations, a new power had quietly, unshakably emerged. And as the bells of Windsor sounded that night, the people didn't ask if Catherine had taken power. They asked how long it would take for the crown to catch up. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.